It was a cold, clear March day at Savage River on the north slope of the Alaska Range. I was sitting on a hill watching a muskeg flat on which several hundred scattered caribou were feeding. A quarter-mile below me, a coal ledge jutted out from the 15-foot-high riverbank, and a yellow seepage from it smeared the blue-white river ice. 5 caribou stood licking at the stain, but I was looking for wolves. Spencer Rempel, the Moose Whisperer, bringing you exciting hunting and outdoor adventure stories from around the world. Today's story is from Frank Glacier of Savage River, Alaska, in the year 1968. Observing wolves hunting is not something many of us get to see. Stay tuned for a thrilling and educational adventure in a vast and untouched northern wilderness. Learn from this hunter, trapper, and even trainer as he shares his knowledge and experience. Who can run faster, a wolf or a caribou? Guaranteed you'll learn something. I know I did. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I glanced at the 5 caribou from time to time as I swung my binoculars to scan the snow-covered land. After an hour of careful watching, I saw a lone gray wolf trotting across the flat. Soon 3 others single-filed down the river to my left. Then another appeared on my right, picking its way upstream. The 5 wolves were converging on the caribou at the coal seep. The wolf on the flat trotted to the edge of the bank above the unsuspecting caribou and peeked over at them. Then it backed off to lie down and wait. The group of 3 wolves left the creek and disappeared into the spruces below me. I lost track of the 5th wolf. I watched the 5 caribou. After about 10 minutes, a gray wolf streaked out of the timber and grabbed a big cow by the flank. The remaining 4 caribou scattered as the frantic cow skidded and staggered, trying to shake the clinging wolf. She tried to jump from the thick ice to the bank, but immediately fell, floundering on her side. The tenacious wolf still clamped to her flank. 3 of the other wolves appeared and swarmed over her, chomping and slashing, and then, incredibly, she pulled free. All of the wolves skidded on the thick ice, but the frantic cow made it to the bank, humped her way to the top, and hooked her front legs over. The wolf on the bank met her head on, sinking its teeth into her nose, and hung on as the 2 of them rolled and flopped down the steep slope to the river ice. A red stain spread across the ice as the 5 wolves killed the cow and started to eat. Another March spring day found me on the same hill, again watching the scattered caribou and looking for wolves. Below on the open flat, a lone cow was feeding. 3 wolves, trotting single file with heads and tails down, started to cross the flat about a half a mile downwind of the caribou. When they caught its scent, one of them, a big gray, immediately lay down in the snow while the others turned and loped into a nearby draw. After his partners had been gone a few minutes, the big gray wolf openly ran to within 100 yards of the caribou, sat down in plain sight, and started to howl. The caribou stopped eating and curiously stared at him. She even walked towards the wolf, occasionally bounding nervously into the air. The 2 other wolves came into sight behind her, sliding along their bellies like cats stalking a bird. Frequently, they raised up and peeked their heads to see how close they were. The caribou remained intent on the performing wolf in front of her. The gray wolf howled, trotted back and forth, and gradually worked closer and closer to the nervous but fascinated caribou. When the wolf was within 40 yards, it sat and howled continuously. One of the stalking animals dashed from behind a knoll about 30 feet from the caribou, grabbed the animal's flank, and hung on. The 2 other wolves joined it in seconds, and the 3 of them quickly pulled her down. There you have 2 common daytime hunting techniques used by wolves. I have seen as many as 6 wolves play the decoy game. They're very good at it. Sometimes, however, wolves simply run their prey down. One April again at Savage River, I saw a cow moose on the skyline running and continually looking behind her. 5 wolves soon showed up on her trail. I grabbed my rifle and ran to an open side hill from which I thought I might be able to take part. The moose ran into a dense patch of spruces, the wolves right behind her. After a while, she came into the open with the wolves jumping and biting at her and then leaping back as she tried to strike them with her hooves. They were too far away for me to interfere, so I sat and watched through my binoculars. She made a good fight of it. As the wolves slashed at her, leaping in and dodging back, she stood on her hind legs time and time again, running at them, pawing and striking with her front hooves. But finally, the wolves simply pulled her down. When I got there, they had eaten a few pounds of the hindquarters and had left. The animal was slashed and bitten all over, and pieces of hide as big as a man's hand had been peeled off. The moose was heavy with calf. I have seen pregnant caribous killed in the same way. As a private trapper and a government wolf hunter, I have observed wolves in Alaska since the late 1920s, when, for the first time in this century, they became common in Alaska's interior. The more I learn about wolves, the less I like to generalize about their hunting methods and other habits. You see, wildlife doesn't live by the rules. I have read many incorrect statements about wolves, two in particular, that many people believe are that all the wolves in a region join forces each night to hunt, and that wolves invariably hamstring big game prey. So, actually, wolf packs are almost always family groups, sometimes containing as many as 2 or 3 generations. However, during breeding season, when different families combine, I have often seen groups of 30 to 45 wolves. At Savage River, I was awakened early one March morning by the howling of several bands of wolves. I got up, dashed out with a rifle and binoculars, and located 3 bunches. As I watched, all 3 came together in a big flat. I guessed that there would be 3 or 4 families. Suddenly, all of those wolves appeared to pile on one wolf, and the growling and yipping carried on. You could hear it for miles in that still, cold air. I saw how I could get within rifle range by working through some timber. As I hurried along, I pictured in my mind 6 or 7 dead wolves and a bunch of crippled ones, and I figured that a lot of hides and bounty money was going to be coming my way pretty easily. But my dreams were shattered when I got within rifle range. All the wolves had left but 2, and those 2 were mated. Not one injured wolf could I see. In the years since, I have found that wolves seldom seriously injure one another when fighting. The largest bunch of wolves I have ever seen numbered 52. I had a good 45 minutes to count them. 50 were black and 2 were gray. The particular thing about these wolves is that they were together in October. Ordinarily, the big packs form only during breeding season in February and March. Except during breeding season, strange wolves are not welcome into a family. I once watched for some time a pair of wolves that had a den with a bunch of pups in it. The family group also contained 4 other adult wolves, which might have been brothers or sisters, parents, or even grandparents of the mated pair. One day, when all 6 adults were lying about sleeping after a night of hunting, a big gray wolf, strange to the group, showed up on a ridge and trotted casually towards the den. One of the adults saw the stranger when he was about 100 yards away and immediately ran towards him. The 5 others were right behind. The first wolf struck the stranger with the shoulder, knocking him over. Before he could recover, all 6 of them had him, holding him from all sides. There was no snapping or letting go as you see in a dogfight. Each of the 6 simply grabbed the visitor and hung on, stretching the wolf out and banging him against the ground. After perhaps 30 seconds of this, they all suddenly let go and stood back. The strange wolf got to its feet, hobbled down the ridge a few hundred yards, and lay down. I didn't see him in the area ever again. Wolves are dog-like in much of their social behavior, and it isn't difficult to take advantage of some of their habits. When I first started to trap on Savage River in 1924, I noticed that my sled dogs refused to pass up the few scattered clumps of grass that were exposed on the high wind-blown ridges. They simply had to lift a leg to every clump, and they'd go far out of their path to reach one of these signposts. The next summer, I planted about 70 clumps of high grass on the ridges that I trapped. I dug holes about 6 inches into the south of each clump and set spikes there to which I could fasten traps. When winter came and trapping started, I simply set the traps in the holes and covered them with dry dirt. Wolves, like my dogs, would get the urge to raise their legs to these isolated clumps to leave their sign. As they did so, they stepped into my traps. These were efficient wolf sets, and I also caught many foxes in them. An occasional wolverine or lynx would visit these clumps of grass too, and I'd have their skins in my cache by spring. I love the sound of a howling wolf, and after hearing it for years, I found that I could imitate it. Often in the 1930s, on quiet evenings at my trapping cabin, it's at Savage River, I would step outside and howl. If wolves were around, they usually answered, and they would frequently howl for hours as I dropped off to sleep. I have called many wolves to within rifle range. Pups are especially easy to call. Once my calling had quite an effect on a superstitious Inuit. On that occasion, I had been sent to Golovin in the Seward Peninsula to try to take some wolves that had been killing the Inuits' reindeer. One morning, I awoke and heard wolves howling near where the deer were grazing. An Inuit herder and I went up to a ridge and counted 9 wolves about 2 miles from us. Soon, a lone wolf howled behind us. I answered him. He called back. We talked back and forth for some time before I spotted him with my binoculars. He was working his way across a big flat. As I watched him, he'd howl when I did and then come closer. We lost sight of him in some low hills, but I kept howling occasionally. Finally, he trotted into sight out of a ravine about 50 yards away, went up on a high snowdrift, and looked around trying to find the wolf he had been talking with. It was an easy shot. For the rest of my stay there, that Inuit herder was half afraid of me, and he passed on his uneasiness to the others in the area. I guess he thought I was some kind of wolf whisperer. I have often watched wolves hunting and killing moose and caribou in the daytime, but more often I have heard them killing caribou at night, and have seen the kills the following day. In my experience, February through April are months during which wolves seem to kill the most big game. The wolf's breeding season starts in February, and family groups merge then as the unpaired wolves select mates. When these large groups join forces, they make heavy kills. When wolves and caribou are numerous at Savage River in the 1930s, I could sense when there was going to be a big kill. As dark came on, there would be a lot of howling. I've heard as many as 4 separate packs within a few miles of my cabin. After the preliminary howling, all would be quiet, and I could almost feel the tension in the hills. When the evening kill was made, usually around 10 or 11 o'clock, howling would start again. And at that time, I'd usually be reading or finishing up a day's skinning. Often, the howling continued for hours after I went to bed. This seemed to be especially true on dark, moonless nights. I often investigated on the day after such a kill. Ravens would be flying around the dead caribou, so they were easy to locate. I'd find from 1 to 15 carcasses. When attacked by wolves at night, a caribou herd crowds together instead of scattering and running. It's easy for wolves to catch the terrified animals and slash open their flanks. The caribou's paunch falls out, he steps on it and drags himself away, and then drops. Almost invariably, all the animals killed in one herd will be within a few hundred feet of one another. I think that the wolf is the brainiest animal in Alaska. He learns well, and he learns fast. A good example of this braininess is the reaction to being shot from a small airplane. In the early 1950s, wolves existed in large numbers in the Arctic slope of the North Brooks Range. Caribou were just recovering from a bad slump, so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for which I worked as a predator agent, organized a wolf hunt with small planes from Omiot in the Colville River. There are no trees in this area, so we could fly low with ski-equipped planes and kill wolves with shotguns loaded with buckshot, a technique that some bounty hunters and sportsmen still use in Alaska. Normally, we search for wolves at an altitude of about 400 feet. When we found a bunch, we'd make a circle a mile or so away, drop to within 40 or 50 feet of the ground, and then come in on them. The wolves usually ran straight away in single file. We'd fly on their left, and the gunner would shoot out of the right side of the plane, often at ranges of only 20 to 30 feet. Usually the first pass at a bunch of wolves was easy and the shooting was simple. But the second pass was another story. By then, the surviving wolves would have learned a lesson. Many of them would weave back and forth at a dead run away from the plane when we got within a couple hundred yards. Occasionally, a really smart wolf would learn to dodge left every time the plane got close, so that he would be underneath the plane and out of sight of the gunner. We buzzed one wolf that stopped at the edge of a high rim. The terrain forced us to come at him from above, and each time we neared, he dropped off the rim and out of sight. When we were directly above him, he would be hard to find and even harder to hit. I fired 8 or 9 shots at that wolf, and as we made pass after pass over him for at least a half an hour. Finally, my pilot made a dangerous approach from below and pushed the animal into the open, where I got a clear shot. The belief that wolves always take sick, crippled, or otherwise misfit animals doesn't always hold true. A wolf will take what is available, and he doesn't go out of his way to kill weak. Wolves commonly kill stragglers, but though some of these animals are weak, others are not. A wolf's teeth, the uppers, fit on the outside of the lowers, working like a pair of shears. His jaw muscles are extremely powerful. At one time, I had in harness a number of dogs that were 3/4 wolf. Their teeth were quite similar to those of pure wolves. They could hold a frozen rib of a moose or a caribou in their front paws, feed it into the sides of their mouth, slicing it off into 1/4-inch pieces, and then grinding those pieces into pulp. A wolf can crack bones that even a grizzly bear can't break. Some people are said to wolf food, and that is an appropriate word in that context. I have opened the stomach of hundreds of wolves and have commonly found fist-sized chunks of meat in there. The female wolf feeds her weaned pups by regurgitating such chunks. I've often seen these pieces around wolf dens. I think that wolves are unusual in their awareness of man. Even in wilderness areas where they have little or no contact with humans, wolves have a pretty definite reaction to an encounter with man. It has also been my experience that the wolf is the only animal to be able to recognize a motionless man for what he is. A bear, moose, caribou, or any other animal I know about in Alaska cannot recognize a motionless man by sight alone, especially if the man's silhouette is broken by a rock or tree. But a wolf can. Several times when I've been absolutely motionless and wearing dull clothing, with the wind in my favor and my outline broken, wolves have approached, looked at me for a moment, and then whirled and run. I don't regard the wolf as a coward, as do many people. Actually, he's very brave. I once watched 2 wolves drive a large grizzly bear from their kill. Another time, I saw a family of wolves drive 3 grizzlies from their den. On still another occasion, in Mount McKinley National Park, I was watching a family of wolves feed on several caribou they had killed. They would sleep, feed a bit, and then sleep some more. Eventually, a big dark grizzly ambled up the river bar, feeding on roots and whatever else he could find. Suddenly, he got the scent of the dead caribou, whirled, sat up, and a moment later he took off at a run towards the carcass of the wolf-killed caribou. 6 wolves were lying near the dead caribou, and when the bear plunged into their midst, they scattered in every direction. One big gray ran off a few hundred yards, stopped, and howled. 4 of the others gathered around her, and then the 5 of them trotted off. The last wolf was a big black. He stood watching as the others filed off. The bear sprawled across one of the carcasses, watching the wolves leave. Then the black wolf walked stiff-legged from behind the bear. As he neared, the bear glanced around but didn't move. The wolf walked as if he were on eggs, his tail straight out, his head straight, almost like a pointer on hot scent. When the wolf was about 10 feet from the grizzly, he leapt and bit the bear's back hard. I clearly heard the bear roar as he launched backwards, reaching for the wolf. The wolf lit out downhill with the bear hot on his trail. The bear gained, finally getting so close that he'd have had the wolf in another jump if the wolf, his tail held low and his hind legs spread, hadn't made an abrupt turn. It was a beautiful maneuver. The bear actually rolled over in his attempt to make the turn. He was mad as a hornet when he picked himself up. He turned, walked back to the meat, and found the wolf already there. The wolf backed off when the bear arrived, and then lay down about 20 feet from the grizzly. But he soon circled, tiptoed close again, leaped, bit, and once more the bear chased him down the hill. The wolf tired of the game after about a half an hour and trotted off in the direction of the other wolves. It's my opinion that the wolf has been called a coward because he is so shy of man, and because he commonly hunts in large groups with the odds in his favor. But these factors demonstrate his intelligence to me. A wolf can become lonely, I believe, if kept away from others of its kind, and a female wolf has a pretty strong maternal feelings towards almost any pup. I used these traits to make $50 when a dollar was worth something. It was spring at Fairbanks, and I was approached by a man named Van Beber, who made a business out of keeping and feeding dogs for people. A couple of months earlier, Van Beber had acquired a 3-year-old female gray wolf from a trader up on the Tanana River. The wolf was in a cage when he got it, and he had released it into a stout pen with about 10 to 12 foot high walls. Van Beber had a buyer willing to pay $200 for the wolf, but he had been unable to catch her and put a collar and chain on her. She was so violent when he tried to force her that he was afraid she'd kill herself. Since I drove wolf dogs and was a trapper, Van Beber reasoned that I was an expert on wolves. He offered me $50 if I could put a chain and collar on the wolf without hurting her. It became obvious that the wolf was terrified of Van Beber, so I asked him to leave. Then I took a 3 or 4 month old pup of his, put it on a chain, sat down in the middle of the pen, and started petting the pup. I spent the afternoon there. Once in a while I released the pup and it would run over to the wolf. She would smell it, it would try to play with her, and she would respond half-heartedly. While petting the pup, I would howl like a wolf, and soon the female was answering me with a real low howl. By that evening, I'd had my hands on the wolf 2 or 3 times, but each time she leapt back stiff-legged, and her mane came up. The next day, I went into the pen with a choke collar in each pocket of my coat, plus a chain. I figured that if I could slip the collar over her head, I could snap the chain onto it afterwards. She circled me one way and then the other, fast and nervously. Again I howled and I used the pup as bait, and I got my hands on her. Twice I almost had the collar on her, but she leapt back. Well, the third day, the wolf was noticeably tamer and very fond of the pup. She obviously had looked forward to our return, or so her actions said so when we came in. It was almost anticlimactic when I slipped the collar over her head and a little later snapped the chain onto it. The wolf's cruelty is not exaggerated. They feel no remorse or pity for their prey. One September day, I noticed a bull moose standing in the river near my cabin. The next day, he was lying on the bank with his head on the ground. I went over to see what was wrong with him and found that though he was alive, he couldn't lift his head. Wolves had eaten 25 or 30 pounds of meat from one of his hindquarters. The suffering animal had been standing in water trying to cool the feverish leg when I first seen him. I shot the moose to end his suffering, then I followed his back trail to see what had happened. 5 wolves had run and pestered him until he became exhausted and fell. They'd eaten what they'd wanted, and then they left. Or perhaps they left because they heard my dogs barking or smelled my cabin. Twice since then, I have found moose in similar conditions, both times in deep snow with a light crust that had supported the wolves, but not the moose. When wolves make a kill and are hungry, they'll usually drink some hot blood and then eat the hams. Sometimes they'll eat the tongue. A large number of wolves may eat an entire animal except for the skull and the very largest bones. And even these will often be cracked open so that the wolves can get at the marrow. There are a great many variables in the relationship between wolves and big game. Some wolves are much faster than others. The speed of big game animals, even those within the same species, varies greatly. It takes a large number of wolves to pull down a mature bull moose that has hard antlers and good footing. But 2 or 3 wolves can finish off the biggest bull that has ever lived if he is antlerless and caught in deep encrusted snow. An animal in advanced pregnancy is vulnerable to wolf predation anytime, but the same animal at another time of the year might be able to run circles around the wolf. For the wolf is actually a relatively slow runner. Because caribou are night blind, one of any age or sex is highly vulnerable on dark nights. During daylight, however, practically any adult caribou can outrun wolves if he sees them in time. Wolves know this and hunt accordingly. In North America, wolves depend more upon caribou for food than upon any other species of big game. Wolves exert strong influence on the caribou herds, especially young caribou. In June 1940 in McKinley Park, Harold Herning, a park ranger, and I were eating lunch on a little hill overlooking a fork in the Teclanica River. In the V of the fork were 350 or so caribou. mostly cows, yearlings, and calves. For several months previously, we had been observing a family of 6 wolves led by a small black female. Now, as we watched, these wolves trotted up the river and, upon smelling the caribou, dashed over the bank toward them. The caribou fled. The little black female was much faster than the other wolves. She soon left them behind. Some 40 or 50 2-week and 3-week-old calves bunched up and dropped behind the main body of the caribou. And the black wolf was soon among them. She grabbed one calf by the middle of the back, reared up, shook it, flung it aside, and continued the chase. She bowled over the next calf with her shoulder. Before it could get up, she grasped it by its back, shook the animal 3 or 4 times, and dropped it. The third one was also knocked over. The fourth calf happened to be on soft ground, on which a wolf is clumsy. The black female hit the calf, knocking it down, but at the same time she stumbled and rolled end over end herself. The calf was the first to get to its feet, and as it started to run, it accidentally bumped into the just recovering wolf, knocking her flat. Despite his savageness, however, I admire the wolf. He's a fascinating animal, and I'd hate to see him disappear. Alaska has taken some steps towards classifying the wolf as big game, thereby reducing the danger of the animal being wiped out in Alaska. The wolf is a trophy of which any sportsman can be proud. But my guess is there won't be many wolves taken by trophy hunters. These fine animals are just too smart for that. Well, that's his story, folks, but I'd like to tell yours. Send in your story to info@themoosewhisperer.com and I'll tell it to the world. You could write it out and send it to me in an email, or even just record it on a voice memo and share it to me the same way. It's darn easy. Just hit record and say, hey, you wouldn't believe this one time I was hunting. Send me a few pics for a short bio as well. I know you've got great stories. Now let me tell them to the world. If you've enjoyed this story and want to support this community, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and most importantly, share. Share with a friend. Thanks for watching, folks. More stories to come.